What's yours? What's yours?
Oh, my end game is that 22% of the world's population want to live as they want to live.
So why can't we then? Why are we
think
getting this shoved down our throat that we can't say that we don't want Sharia laws? Why is that?
What you have just witnessed is live footage of a self-proclaimed patriotic woman protesting amongst actual concerned Canadian citizens who stand in solidarity with the people whose humanity she disrespects. The scene took place on March the 4th, Saturday, at Springer Market in Kingston, Canada, where a private protest event is called to counter a protest hosted by inherently Islamophobic organization with its roots in Canada. With the pathing of anti-Islamophobia emotion, xenophobic and Islamophobic protesters came to the streets across Canada, only to meet counter-protesters such as the crowd at Springer Market. Kingston is only one of the many towns where this counter-protest happened. However, like many small white towns across Canada, this seemingly peaceful town harbors a lot of invisible hate that the activists in this town constantly fight against. For those of you who have never been to Kingston, this town not only hosts a prestigious Canadian university, it is also the birthplace for John A. Macdonald, a household Prime Minister name. He was known to bring the Confederation together and has the equivalent significance of American founding fathers in Canada. Similar to the founding fathers of the United States of America, many do not know that he is responsible for Indigenous genocide. I remember his infamous Chinese Exclusion Act was mentioned in the corners of grade 7 history textbook, but nothing was written about his white supremacy speech and rhetoric even shocked his contemporaries back in the 1800s. This is the town where the counter-protest happens. Kingston, the first capital of Canada and the birthplace of one of the pioneers of European colonialism. The lone woman with Canadian flag in her hands may seem vulnerable, but her rhetoric of hate is actually the minority in this little peaceful university town. Only earlier last year, groups of folks were seen on the streets with homophobic, racist rhetorics written on their banners. Trump supporters showed up disrespecting Women's March in Kingston. A white supremacist like John A. Macdonald's birthday is celebrated and commemorated. To make the matter worse, media and the police protect this rhetoric of hateful speech. During the protests against John A. Macdonald last year, Indigenous activists from I Don't Know More burned an effigy of Macdonald. No violence erupted during the protests. Only rightful anger is present. Yet police were still called to protect those who commemorated Macdonald because of an actually unrelated act of vandalism took place overnight. Despite activists behaving properly according to the rules of law during the commemoration, they were still painted in bad light by mainstream media. As you can see, activist voices are strong and persistent. They can still be vulnerable in the face of institutional power and media, like the two sole protesters who camped at Everfell in Halifax. Unbeknown to a lot of people in Canada, these kind of protests against racism and white supremacy are not new to Canada. The protest in Everfell is one of the earliest examples of that. Everfell, a traditional black-owned community housing complex in the 1800s, removed and erased from the geography by the government. Activists in Kingston face dangerous slanders and erasure from the media as well. Things have now changed in this 100 years. In my knowledge, this solidarity counter-protest is one of the few protests where the law enforcement doesn't have a strong presence and hateful rhetoric will driven away instead of being protected. Activism doesn't always come in the form of protest. Protest means to raise awareness, promote actions, and make statements. It is one of the most performative forms of activism. However, the performative nature of protest does not suggest the protest as an insincere or ineffective form of activism. It only means that protest often has a theatrical element to it. all individuals express multitude of mannerisms, attitudes, and words to perform to the situation they're in. In the case of protests, they need to add a sense of theatricality to this set of mannerism attitudes to achieve the ultimate goals of making statements and promoting changes. As demonstrated in this protest that took place on Saturday, the mannerism and attitudes range from holding signs and banners with provoking words and strong statements written on them, to shouting concise and catchy slogans.
Ho! I say go, you say ho, racists go home!
To active engagement with hateful rhetoric. The activists perform much like the lone woman with Canadian flag, performing the front of a patriotic citizen that attempts to protect Canadian values built from inherently violent European colonialism, occupying space and pushing against those with hateful rhetoric might not always look pretty, but it's part of keeping the marginalized groups, in this case, Muslims in Canada, safe. The counter-protesters later on criticized other counter-protesters' effort in pushing away protesters of hateful rhetoric, because this angry reaction seemed like bullying to him. This reminds me of the town's university student publication, Queen's Journal, speaking ill of the burning of effigy of John A. Macdonald last year. No one condones violence. However, people tend to scrutinize violent or angry reactions from protesters protesting against hateful rhetoric that puts their lives in jeopardy. An indigenous woman whose name I shall not name here in the protest has revealed that when a hateful group represented by the lone woman with Canadian flag is allowed to have platform speech, she was beaten into a coma. Racial minorities were not only harassed, but physically harmed by those hateful rhetoric. Racism as an institution is inherently violent, and yet people still frown upon minorities reacting angrily to an inherently violent system. After hours slogan shouting and noise-making, the counter-protester crowd eventually drives the hateful protester away. The organizers conclude that the counter-protest is successful, but only a small step forward in pushing for real changes. After all, clash of ideologies does not directly lead to death of hateful rhetoric, but it is a step toward that. Kingston is a small town, but despite not being the center of large fight against xenophobia and Islamophobia in Canada, the small town shows the hate it harbors through hateful display, insensitive celebration, and erasure of systemic violence minorities suffer, and that hate threatens safety of minorities living in the town from day to day. The activists in the town might not always gain victory in driving away the hateful sentiments and retorts for the safety of minorities and marginalized groups under the law enforcement and media's effort in maintaining the status quo. But as demonstrated in the Saturday protests, they're trying their best in sending strong ideological messages through performance of protests that calls for real social and political changes in ideological atmosphere in Kingston.